All right, guys. So I actually published a similar video to this, and I just took it down because I was traveling. And to be honest with you, I didn't do very much research. And so because of that, my information ended up being sloppy. So thank you for bearing with me. This is take 2 on this subject. And this time I'm going to go through a more thorough explanation of what is going on. So thank you so much for bearing with me. Now, big tech has been increasingly and alarmingly censoring users from sharing opinions and articles. They do it in the name of fact-checking or stopping the spread of misinformation or protecting democracy has been the latest one that they have been saying over and over. And when being accused of hindering free speech, the most common defense is that these companies are private, that they are not government, and so they could do whatever they think is best for their business. But that is not actually the case, because what is really behind this increased moderation by these big tech companies. I mean, what is it? We know it isn't the free market, because it is bad for these internet companies to be hindering people's thoughts, to be hindering their opinions, what they want to share. We know that that's actually bad for their business. So it's not free market. It isn't they're making decisions based on the market, based on what people want. We're not seeing large boycotts where people say, well, if you don't remove this information, we're boycotting, or even if they do threaten it, it's not enough to put a dent into these big companies. So what is it really that is actually causing them to censor us? And what it is Congress. Congress, the government, has been intimidating these companies since 2016 by threatening regulations. And that seems to me to be an infringement on the First Amendment directly. When Congress says do something or else, that sounds like an infringement on the freedom of speech. So I want to read for you some of the articles. Here's one right here. Facebook, Twitter executives to face Congress on fake news. This was from 2018, okay? So about 2 years ago, says, with the midterm elections 2 months away, Facebook Chief Operating Officer Sheryl Sandberg and Twitter Chief Executive Jack Dorsey will testify Wednesday on Capitol Hill on the topics of eliminating fake news and alleged political censorship. Now, what we noticed is that a lot of these hearings in the House started in 2018, because that's when Democrats took control over Congress, over the House. And a lot of these calls for censorship are coming from the Democrats. And I'm going to show you this point by point, how Republicans are actually, interestingly, the ones who've been attempting to protect our ability to our freedom of expression. And it's actually been Democrats who've been limiting us. Says the two social media giants are under intense scrutiny, initially due to revelations that emerged from the Cambridge Analytica data privacy scandal. The scandal revolves around fake news and Russian meddling in the 2016 elections. Republicans and Democrats have expressed a willingness to regulate the two platforms, but I'm going to explain to you why Republicans want to, because it's an important distinction, and this is sort of what I failed to do in my previous attempt at this video, was explain why both sides are wanting to regulate, but they're wanting to regulate for very different reasons. Republicans and Democrats have expressed a willingness to regulate the two platforms. This comes as Facebook and Twitter cull their networks of fake accounts and ridding them of hate speech and harassment. Sandberg and Dorsey will face the Senate Intelligence Committee on the spread of misinformation and measures to prevent that. Now, this all began as stopping Russian misinformation, right? I mean, they said, oh, it was the Russians. They created fake accounts. They created bots, and they weren't even real people. And they were going around and they were saying things that weren't true, or they were in a variety of creative ways and just buying advertisements. They were infiltrating American democracy. That was the claim. So they originally went after these companies and said, you have to do something about these Russians, and not just Russian people, but Russian bots. You have to do something about that. And that is now morphed into, you have to do something about these Americans who want to share fake news and lies. You have to do something about it. Another article here for you. This was from last year. This was a year ago. It says Facebook's Zuckerberg takes broad lashing on Libra 2020 election and civil rights at congressional hearing. The social media giant's chief executive took an early lashing Wednesday over the company's policies to spot and prevent the spread of disinformation. Congressional lawmakers delivered a broad lashing of Facebook chief executive Mark Zuckerberg on Wednesday, sniping at his company's plans to launch a digital currency, its pockmarked track record on privacy and diversity, diversity, and it struggles to prevent the spread of misinformation. Now, it always starts with, well, at least it had been. It's currently, they're about to go into another hearing October 28th, but it's always been, okay, we're bringing you in over something else. It was Cambridge Analytica, and then it was this cryptocurrency. But it always morphs into, what are you going to do about fake news? What are you going to do about misinformation? What are you going to do about censoring Americans? Damn it, we want to know what you're going to do about that. How are you going to censor them some more? The wide-ranging criticisms came largely from Democrats during a hearing of the House Financial Services Committee, which convened the session to probe Facebook's plan to launch a cryptocurrency called Libra. Facebook's efforts have we'll just move on from here. It says Quickly, though, the hearing expanded in focus, reflecting the simmering frustrations on Capitol Hill with practically the entirety of Facebook's business. Rep. Maxine Waters, the panel's chairwoman, cited the news that Facebook removed from its platform a number of efforts to spread disinformation, including a Russian campaign predominantly on Facebook-owned Instagram that targeted users in swing states such as Florida. She said it showed foreign malefactors are at it again 4 years after Russians took aim at the 2016 race. They could never get over that, right? It was the Russians. It was never their own selves. It was the Russians. She also criticized Facebook's decision not to fact-check political ads. Representative Rashida Tlaib later echoed those concerns that Facebook permits a lower standard for truthfulness and decency for politicians, adding, "It's hate speech, it's hate, and it's leading to violence and death threats in my office." Look, Democrats, and many of them we consider to be progressives, are actually calling for these big tech companies to censor and silence Americans. Whatever they consider to be misinformation or fake news, they want to be eliminated. And it's been Democrats who've been putting on the pressure. And once again, it started off with, we've got to stop the Russians, we've got to stop these fake accounts and these bots, and you've got to remove all these fake accounts. That has morphed into stop all information and fake news, stop the liars. I want to play this clip for you. This is Maxine Waters and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez putting the pressure on Mark Zuckerberg about what is he going to do about fake news and liars. Here it is.
Do you see a potential problem here with a complete lack of fact-checking on political advertisements?
Well, Congresswoman, I think lying is bad, and I think if you were to run an ad that had a lie, that would be bad.
You won't take down lies, or you will take down lies? I think it's just a pretty simple yes or no.
Have you learned that you should not lie?
But here's the thing. The problem is that these are not Russians that they're limiting. These are everyday Americans. And actually who they're censoring ranges from just your average everyday American who wants to share certain articles or share. Mostly at this point, we've seen a lot of censoring on the sharing of articles. But it's also, we've seen morph to censoring doctors and scientists and journalists and former government officials and even current government officials. People like myself are being censored and limited. I've been throttled for months now here on YouTube. People are saying they don't see the notifications anymore, or obviously my growth has stalled out, and it's because they have decided that some of my content is not along the lines of what their mainstream narrative that they want to try to promote to the mainstream. And so this is what they do to people, and journalists and doctors and scientists and anyone, is that they just decide to limit them. So now coming up, October 28th, CEOs of Google, Facebook, and Twitter have been issued subpoenas to appear in front of the Senate for another round of hearings. Here is the article. This was from October 1st. It says Section 230 will be on the chopping block at the next big tech hearing. It looks like we're in for another big tech CEO hearing. The Senate Commerce Committee voted Thursday to move forward with subpoenas for Twitter's Jack Dorsey, Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg, and Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Alphabet, which is Google, which is YouTube. The unusual decision to subpoena the social media chief executive adds yet another politically volatile event to the schedule in the run-up to the most contentious election in modern U.S. history. The hearing will focus on Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, the key law that shields online platforms from legal liability for their content their users create. While the topic might sound dry for the unacquainted, the law is an explosive topic, both politically and in the eyes of the tech industry, which could be left reeling from even what might seem like minor changes to the legal shield. Committee Chairman Roger Wicker called the decision to hold the hearing imperative in order for Americans to receive full accounting from the heads of these companies about their content moderation practices. Remarkably, the decision to subpoena the CEOs was unanimous, with ranking Democrat Maria Cantwell joining the vote to subpoena the companies after initially opposing the decision. Cantwell previously called the idea of issuing subpoenas an extraordinary step intended to chill the efforts of companies to remove misinformation and harassment from their platforms. So that's interesting. She's not saying, oh, if we remove Section 230, this is going to chill the efforts of freedom of speech, and this is going to chill the First Amendment. No, she's saying this is going to chill their efforts of removing all that misinformation and harassment from their platforms. We need them to do more of this, is what she says. Republican members of the Senate Commerce Committee include Wicker, Ted Cruz, John Thune, and Rick Scott. Democrats on the committee include Cantwell, Amy Klobuchar, Brian Schatz, and Kirsten Sinema. So you see, this article was from October 1st. Now, some of you were saying in my previous recording that this subpoena, that these tech giants were being subpoenaed because the Republican Senate wanted answers about their halting of the New York Post article. But that article actually came out October 14th. So these subpoenas and this forcing these tech companies to appear in person in front of the Senate had been in motion at least 2 weeks prior to that article. So this doesn't have anything to do with the article, sort of. I mean, the article obviously falls under the umbrella of what these guys want to talk about. So we're going to get into here Section 230. Now, Section 230, what they're wanting to discuss with these tech giants is a protection given to internet service providers that says you're providing a service, you are not a publisher or a speaker, so you are not responsible for what third-party people, what a third party would say or share while using your service. Okay, so there's a difference between service providers and publishers. So they do have some bounds on this. They do say that they do have to do their best to remove obscene content and illegal content, such as the sale of drugs or trafficking or even copyright infringement. And then there's further protection that they built into the Section 230 for times when a content an internet provider would want to remove content that they deem to be obscene for their users, but the content was actually protected by the First Amendment, so as long as they were acting in good faith. That's what this Section 230 says. And that's an important point to remember. You're going to need to remember that here in a moment as we go further. So as long as they removed it in good faith, they wouldn't be held liable for hindering the First Amendment. So that's interesting that that's even built into that, because a lot of people say, well, they're private companies, they could do whatever they want. Not actually according to the law. According to the law, if they are wanting to be protected by Section 230, then they're just providing you a service. So it's sort of like a telephone operator. If you are, for example, somebody that you really think is offensive, like David Duke, I don't think he could be denied a telephone. A cell phone company can't say, no, we're not going to issue you a cell phone because we're afraid of how you're going to use that cell phone. And they also can't say, we're going to start listening into your conversations, or we're going to start cutting the line when we think you've said something that's over the top. And they also, like an electricity provider wouldn't shut down the electricity for his meeting house because they say, well, the meeting that you're going to be having there is something that we don't want to be held liable for providing electricity to your meeting house, where you're going to be having abhorrent meetings that we don't agree with, that we think are, against everything. So that is the difference. If you are a service provider, you are not supposed to be limiting anybody or hindering anything. You're just supposed to be providing the service, and you're neutral. And that gives you protections from any liabilities. That's what Section 230 did. So a publisher, on the other hand, is expected to know what the content is before it's published out to the world. So they moderate, they fact check, they maybe go through peer review, they've got editors, and then they put it out there. So once they put it out there, they could be held accountable if the content is illegal or harmful in some way, because they supposedly have gone through it and they put their stamp of approval on it. That's the difference. So to understand this better, we've got to go back to 1959. There was a Supreme Court case, Smith versus California. Smith was a bookstore. California was California with laws. And the bookstore owner was actually put in jail for 30 days for selling what the state considered to be an obscene book. It was a lesbian-based book. And they considered that obscene in 1959. And they actually put this bookstore owner in jail for 30 days. So sues, goes to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled that in favor of the bookstore and said that putting the liability on a provider, which would be the bookstore in this case, would cause bookstores to refuse to sell certain books out of fear, and thus it would limit access to information. So the Supreme Court said, nope, you cannot hold the bookstore liable. They're just a provider. They're not the editor, they're not the publisher, they're just the provider. Even, and this is an important point, even though the bookstore is selling books and making a profit, because a lot of people also use that argument. They say, well, these companies, they're putting advertisements on the content, they're making money, that's wrong, so therefore they should be held accountable. Not according to the Supreme Court, not according to this. They say that that is actually going to hinder a person's access to information, and you cannot do that. Another example of the courts distinguishing who is a provider versus a publisher are in the 90s cases against CompuServe and Prodigy. Both were internet providers at the time. But CompuServe actually said, we're not going to do any moderation. We're not going to do anything. We're just going to let it rip. And Prodigy, on the other hand, at the time said, you know what, we're going to moderate our content, and we're going to hire moderators and have them look through stuff. So when both companies were sued by somebody who felt like they were harmed by the content that was published, when those cases went to court, they were ruled on differently. CompuServe, they ended up being protected. They were found not liable because they were not hiring moderators. Therefore, they were just providing a service. Prodigy, on the other hand, was found liable for the content because they had hired moderators and they started acting as a publisher. Because they had hired moderators, the judges said, well, you had moderators on staff who were supposed to determine whether or not something was harmful or whatever it might have been. Therefore, you missed it, and so you're held responsible. So one was considered a publisher, one was considered a provider, even though they were both really the same sort of company. There's also a really important case against AOL, and it was a man who was suing AOL because people had essentially doxed him on his telephone number, kept circulating on the internet as being linked to the Oklahoma City bombings. And so he was, of course, being harassed because people kept sharing his number, saying that he was the Oklahoma City bomber or somehow connected in some way. So he sued AOL for allowing his telephone number to be circulating out there and putting himself at risk. This is something we hear a lot about today with doxing and whatnot. Anyway, he lost that case. The courts ruled in favor of AOL, saying, well, they're not responsible for the doxing. That was the people who did it would be responsible, not the actual provider who just offers a service. So essentially, what you say on your telephone calls or in your meeting houses, the person providing you the telephone or providing you the building, your landlord or the people giving you the electricity or whoever are not responsible for whatever you do, the content you share on those phone calls, conference calls like Zoom. Could you imagine if Zoom is held liable for allowing meetings for groups that they find abhorrent or something? And so now they're suddenly liable for that. That is a provider versus a publisher. So also in the 90s, what's interesting, so the Democrats who actually crafted Section 230, and it was passed under Bill Clinton, they also attempted to limit certain types of information on the internet. And in the 90s, it was pornography. That was very much the topic. And they wanted to limit children from having access to it. So what they wanted to do in Section 230, what they actually wrote into it was that internet providers would be held responsible if children were sent obscene material. And that actually was also struck down by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, no, they are not the ones responsible. You're holding the wrong people responsible. You've got to hold the people who send it responsible, not because they sent it through their service. So now, why are Republicans and Democrats threatening to repeal Section 230? Well, Republicans are saying, what's the point of giving you these protections, this immunity from being liable for anything people say or do when you are clearly acting as a publisher? Therefore, you should not have protections under Section 230. It shouldn't apply to you. So they're kind of thinking none of these internet providers are acting like providers. They're acting like publishers. So we should just get rid of 230. So they're threatening them, saying, you're going to lose all of your protections because you're behaving like a publisher. That to me makes some sense, actually, to say, look, why should I protect you when you're clearly not behaving in the way that this law would apply to? Now, Republicans have continued to try to get these internet companies to stop doing what they're doing to stop the censoring and limiting. So in December of 2018, Republican Representative Louis Gohmert introduced the Biased Algorithm Deterrence Act, H.R. 492, which would remove all of Section 230 protections for any provider that used filters or any other type of algorithms to display user content when otherwise not directed by a user. So they wanted to say, look, you can't build your algorithms to use censorship. So he tries to make this law. In June of 2019, Representative Josh Hawley, also Republican, introduced the Ending Support for Internet Censorship Act that would remove Section 230 protections from companies who basically did not pass a certification from the FTC that they were neutral or not moderating any content. So they wanted them to go through some sort of a government. Interestingly, and this was kind of got some pushback from some other Republicans who were like, wait, we like less government. We don't want more government. So they were saying we don't want them to have to go through more government checks in order to get a certification that would then continue to give them Section 230 protections. Democrats, who, like I mentioned, crafted the legislation in the 90s, say the reason why they want to get rid of Section 230 is they say, look, we gave you that clause, that Good Samaritan clause. I said, remember that clause where it says they could take down obscene or offensive content that they thought was too obscene or too offensive for their audience if it was done in good faith, even if it was protected speech by the First Amendment. They said, look, we gave you that clause, and you're not using it to the maximum. We want you to use it more. And because you're not willing to use that clause of removing content, then we're not going to give you the protections. So they said, actually, they called it a sword and a shield. We gave you the sword where you could take down that obscene and offensive content. And because you're not using the sword, we're not going to give you the shield. That's what the Democrats are saying. They want more censorship. In fact, Beto O'Rourke stated in his campaign that he wanted to introduce sweeping changes to Section 230 to make internet companies liable for not being proactive in taking down hate speech. Also, Joe Biden has also called for Section 230 protections to be weakened or revoked by big tech companies, particularly Facebook, having stated in a January 2020 interview with the New York Times that Facebook is not merely an internet company, it is propagating falsehoods they know to be false, and that the U.S. needed to set standards. Nancy Pelosi has also chimed in saying that she would like to consider repealing Section 230, but again, the Democrats want to repeal Section 230 because they believe that they don't think the internet companies are doing enough to stop the spread of misinformation and what they consider misinformation, which is basically anything that's against them. And so they want to remove their protections as a threat of do it or else, which is, I think, an absolute infringement on the First Amendment for them to be using their government office, their government power, to threaten and intimidate these big tech companies into censorship. That sounds like a case for the courts. Republicans, on the other hand, are saying we're going to repeal it because you guys aren't actually providers. You have crossed the line into publishers, which I think I agree with that. I don't think they should repeal Section 230 necessarily. Why don't they just, I don't know how that works as far as how do they label, how does a company qualify to be under Section 230 versus not? And maybe they could just say you don't qualify anymore rather than just saying we're getting rid of this rule. Now, what's really interesting, I want to end on this note, is how liberal media is actually spinning this as somehow the Trump administration stifling freedom. So I want to read this Vox article for you that just came out a couple of days ago. 3 days ago, it says, what the FCC can and can't do to Section 230. Trump wants the FCC to help him rewrite Section 230, the law that protects the internet as we know it. But the agency isn't that powerful. It says the Trump administration is once again trying to force social media platforms to do its bidding. This time, the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, has been tapped to use a law called Section 230 to prevent websites from moderating content in a way that many conservatives believe is biased against them. I'm not a conservative, and I think it's biased against me. In fact, many of my progressive friends who are here on the internet doing independent media will say we are not conservatives, and yet this is working against us. It isn't just conservatives who this is harming. It's anybody who doesn't tout the mainstream establishment Democratic lines. And if you don't fall in line with the mainstream Democratic establishment, you are fake news. says, despite the law being designed to prevent FCC intervention and the FCC itself using that as justification not to regulate the internet just a few years ago, it appears the agency is going to try. This comes after Trump and many conservatives have called for Twitter and Facebook to be punished after the platform suppressed links to the New York Post's questionably sourced story about Hunter Biden. This prompted another all-caps demand from Trump to repeal Section 230 and the Republican-led Senate to prepare to subpoena Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey, accusing the company of election interference. So, this is just really, really... Then they go on here to say the FCC isn't the thought police, but legal experts, former FCC commissioners and staff among them, don't think the FCC is allowed to regulate the internet in this way. This is gaslighting at its finest. So you've got this liberal media outlet who's trying to say to its audience that it is the Republicans who are actually trying to hinder and suppress your thoughts, that they're going to be the thought police, and that they're coming around and they're trying... this is gaslighting at its finest. It is not the Republicans who are trying to be the thought police. It's actually not. It's actually not the Republicans who are the ones trying to threaten Section 230 in order to take away your rights. No, that's the Democrats. That's actually very clearly, in their own words, the Democrats. Very much so. So I just want to put that out there, that this is also part of the problem, right? Like, why is this article allowed and other articles are suppressed when this is clearly the fake news in my mind? These guys are sitting there trying to tell people, trying to make people believe that their rights are being threatened by Trump, and that is actually not the case. So, hopefully that was I know this was a long one, but a better glimpse of what is actually going on and how we are absolutely, our freedom of speech, our freedom of expression is under attack. And I got to tell you, I am very worried about this. And after researching more and seeing that the Democrats have very clearly, even since the 90s, been the ones more apt to hinder our speech and hinder the internet, hinder expression. Look, they always say, people, they vote one way against their own interests. They vote against their interests. I am not going to vote against my interests. I will not, from this point forward, be voting for another Democrat ever again. I'm not going to do it. This is the party of censorship. And for me, that is my livelihood. I cannot vote against my own self-interests. So that's a problem for me. I'm very concerned about this. I'm very concerned. I'm really concerned if Trump wins again and the Democrats have Congress, what they might do if they take the Senate and they have the House. Luckily, I think if Trump wins again, he would veto these types of things if they attempted to do things to make big tech censor us some more. Then again, I'm really worried if Joe Biden wins and Democrats win everything and they do actually get away with passing more legislation to censor us in a way to prevent another Trump. That is very frightening to me. So thank you guys so much for watching. Please subscribe and hit that notification bell. Don't know if it'll work because I'm being throttled big time here, but at least we could try. So thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support the channel, the links are down below. Thank you again.